When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 100 operational U-boats surfaced to give themselves up, while hundreds of others lay sunk, scuttled or rotting in port. Over the next year the Allies decided the fate of what had been the most feared submarine fleet in the world. Some were deliberately sunk in a vast operation called Operation Deadlight, some were divided up as technological prizes between the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union. A handful became the core of post-war navies or museum ships, and a few slipped away to distant ports like Argentina before finally surrendering. This is the story of what became of those U-boats once the shooting stopped. The last days of the U-boat war. By early 1945 the German U-boat arm was a shadow of the force that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1940–42. Allied radar, sonar, air patrols and escort groups had turned the wolf packs into hunted prey. More than 750 U-boats had already been lost during the war. Fuel, trained crews and safe bases were all running out. Even so, Germany still possessed a substantial submarine fleet on paper. One post-war analysis notes that around 728 U-boats were still functional when Germany collapsed, though many were incomplete, damaged or trapped in port. As Allied armies closed in on Germany's North Sea and Baltic bases in May 1945, the Naval Command faced an unpleasant question: should these submarines be handed over, or destroyed so that no enemy could use them? Operation Regenbogen, scuttle them rather than surrender. Within the Kriegsmarine there was a strong tradition of scuttling rather than surrendering ships, going back to the scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet at Scapa Flow after World War I. In the chaotic last days of the Third Reich, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz and his staff prepared Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow, a plan for the mass destruction of the remaining fleet, including U-boats, to keep them out of Allied hands. From the beginning of May 1945, U-boat crews started to sink their own vessels in German and Danish harbors. At Travemünde, near Lübeck, 32 boats were scuttled on May 2nd. At Kiel and Hamburg another 39 boats went under the next day. On May 4th more were destroyed in the Kiel Canal and at Flensburg. In the early hours of May 5th, the formal Regenbogen order was transmitted, and then cancelled just 8 minutes later. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had insisted that all German naval forces must surrender intact, and Donitz feared that continuing mass scuttling might jeopardize surrender negotiations and the safety of German civilians and POWs. But the cancellation came too late for many boats. By May 5th, at least 87 more U-boats were destroyed, including 41 at Gelting Bay, 13 at Flensburg and 23 along the North Sea coast. By the time of the general surrender on May 8th, historians estimate that around 195 U-boats had been scuttled by their own crews in the first week of May alone. Surrender. More than 150 U-boats give themselves up. After Donitz ordered all U-boats to cease hostilities on 4–5 May, surviving boats began surfacing and heading to designated Allied ports under white flags and black surrender pennants. Research on the surrender phase gives slightly different totals, but the broad picture is consistent. At least 150 U-boats surrendered to Allied navies either at sea or in port. Another breakdown notes that 52 boats surrendered at sea and 98 in port, mostly in Norway, Germany, Denmark and France. By the time Allied authorities had finished counting, 156 surrendered U-boats were under their control, not counting those already scuttled by their own crews. These surrendered boats were concentrated at a few key anchorages. Dozens were moored in long rows at Lissahallie in Northern Ireland and Loch Ryan in Scotland, guarded by Allied warships. Others lay in Norwegian fjords and German ports, awaiting decisions from the victors. For the first time in history, one side held intact the bulk of an enemy's submarine fleet. The question now was, what to do with it? The Allied dilemma: keep a few, destroy the rest. The problem was political as much as military. The U-boats represented advanced technology, especially the new Type XXI and XCI, electric boats, which were far ahead of Allied designs in underwater speed, battery capacity, and streamlined hull form. No major navy wanted those secrets to be monopolized by a rival. At the Potsdam Conference in July, August 1945, the United States, United Kingdom and Soviet Union agreed in principle to divide the captured German fleet and to set up a tripartite naval commission, TNC, to decide which ships each ally would get. The Potsdam Agreement specified that only a small number of warships and U-boats would be retained, the rest were to be destroyed by a set deadline. The TNC began work in August 1945. After inspection tours of surrendered vessels in the UK, USA, Canada, Norway and elsewhere, it recommended that only 30 U-boats be retained in total, 10 each for the US, Britain and the USSR, for trials and technical evaluation. In October 1945, at its 18th meeting, the TNC decided that all unallocated U-boats were to be sunk in the open sea, in at least 100 meters of water, by February 15, 1946. That decision set the stage for one of the least known but largest submarine disposal operations in history, Operation Deadlight. Operation Deadlight, scuttling the U-boat fleet. Operation Deadlight was the British-led plan to get rid of most of the surrendered U-boats by towing them into the North Atlantic northwest of Ireland and sinking them. Of the 156 U-boats that had surrendered, 116 were ultimately scuttled under Operation Deadlight between November 1945 and February 1946. The rest were either allocated to Allied navies, lost earlier, or otherwise disposed of. The plan was straightforward on paper. The Royal Navy would tow the submarines from holding ports such as Lissahalli and Loch Ryan to 3 designated deep-water areas, codenamed XX, YY and ZZ, about 100 miles, 160 kilometers, northwest of Ireland. Some boats would be used as live targets for bombers and surface ships, others would be sunk by explosive charges or gunfire. In practice, Deadlight was messy and dangerous. Many U-boats had been lying for months in exposed harbors with minimal maintenance, and were in poor structural condition. Heavy Atlantic winter weather made towing hazardous. As a result, 56 of the 116 boats sank prematurely under tow before ever reaching the scuttling zones. Those that did arrive were usually finished off by naval gunfire or aerial attack rather than carefully placed charges. The first Deadlight sinking took place on November 17, 1945, the last on 11 to 12 February 1946. Since then, none of the Deadlight U-boats has been raised. They remain on the seabed as corroding war graves and historical artifacts. U-boats kept for study and service. While most of the surrendered fleet went to the bottom during Deadlight, a select group of U-boats had a very different fate. These boats were distributed among the victorious navies and, in a few cases, to smaller Allied states. United Kingdom. Britain was initially allocated 10 U-boats by the Tripartite Naval Commission, including examples of the advanced Type XXI and XEI designs as well as older Type 7 boats. The Royal Navy commissioned several of them with British crews for intensive trials. They were used to study German underwater tactics, snorkel technology and high-speed submerged operations, and to develop new anti-submarine warfare techniques. However, post-war budget pressures meant that Britain did not keep them long. By 1946-47, most of the ex-German boats in British hands were either passed on to other navies, notably France, or themselves used as targets and sunk once tests were complete. United States. The U.S. Navy also received 10 U-boats according to TNC plans, including the celebrated Type XXI boats U-2513 and U-3008, plus others transferred via Canada and directly from Germany. American crews operated these U-boats to probe their capabilities and weaknesses. The tests confirmed that the Type XXI represented a generational leap, much higher underwater speed, quieter running and rapid battery recharge through the snorkel. But like Britain, the US saw no reason to keep German boats indefinitely. Most of them were sunk as targets in weapons tests or torpedo practice by 1946-47. One early surrender, U-505, had been captured intact in 1944 and used for intelligence work. After the war, the Navy also planned to sink her as a target, but a campaign led by her wartime captor, Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery, saved the boat from destruction. In 1954, U-505 was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where she remains today as one of the world's best-known preserved U-boats. Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was allocated 10 U-boats, including Type XXI and Type XXI examples, as well as conventional Type 7 and 9 designs. These boats were incorporated into the Soviet Navy and studied intensively. Although details of Soviet trials are less well documented, naval historians widely agree that German technology had a strong influence on early Cold War Soviet submarine classes such as the Project 613 Whiskey class, which adopted many Type XXI features. By the early 1950s, the original German hulls had largely been retired or scrapped, but their design legacy lived on in new Soviet-built boats. France and Norway. Smaller Allied navies also benefited. Britain transferred some of its allocated U-boats to Allies. France received several boats, the most notable being U-2518, a Type XXI submarine that entered French service as Roland Marillet. She served into the 1960s as an active combat and test vessel, giving the French Navy first-hand experience with advanced German underwater design. Norway, whose coasts had housed many German submarine bases, acquired U-995, a Type XXI/41 boat. Renamed Cora, she served in the Royal Norwegian Navy until 1965 before being sold back to West Germany for a symbolic 1 Deutsche Mark and turned into a museum ship at Lebo near Kiel. U-boats in distant waters, Japan and the Far East. Not all German submarines were in Europe when the war ended. For U-boats, U-181, U-195, U-219 and U-862 were operating in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific as part of long-range missions supplying or cooperating with Japan. When Germany surrendered, these boats were commandeered by the Imperial Japanese Navy. U-181 became I-501, U-195 became I-506, and so on. Their subsequent fates varied, but most were scuttled or sunk by the Japanese or the Allies during or immediately after Japan's own surrender in September 1945, as part of the general elimination of Axis naval power. Escapes, rumors, and the Argentine U-boats. The chaotic end of the war at sea produced some dramatic stories. The most famous involved 2 U-boats that refused to surrender immediately, and instead fled across the Atlantic. U-530 left Norway in April 1945 and reached Mar del Plata, Argentina, only on July 10, 2 months after the German surrender. Her captain scuttled the ship's log and some equipment before surrendering, fueling rumors that he had landed Nazi leaders or treasure in South America. Allied investigations found no evidence for this. The Argentine Navy turned the boat over to the United States, and in 1947 she was sunk as a target by the U.S. submarine USS Toro. U-977 set out from Norway in May 1945, spending an extraordinary 66 days submerged using her snorkel on the way south. She finally surrendered to Argentine authorities on August 17, 1945. As with U-530, rumors spread that U-977 had carried Hitler or other high-ranking Nazis to a secret refuge. Again, Allied interrogations and later research failed to support these conspiracy theories. U-977 was taken to the United States and then sunk as a target off Massachusetts in November 1946. These 2 long-range voyages captured the imagination of post-war writers, but in strict military terms they ended the same way as most other U-boats, as hulks on the ocean floor. How U-boat technology shaped the Cold War. The German U-boat fleet was physically destroyed, but its ideas lived on. The Type XXI in particular is often called the first true modern submarine, designed to fight submerged rather than surface running, with streamlined hull, powerful batteries, snorkel and greatly increased underwater speed. All the major navies studied captured Type XXI hulls and documentation. The United States applied German lessons in its post-war Guppy modernization program, upgrading existing fleet submarines with snorkels, better batteries and more streamlined conning towers. Many features of the U.S. tank class and subsequent designs can be traced to this influence. The Soviet Union, starting from a weaker pre-war submarine industry, drew even more directly on German technology. Early post-war classes such as the Whiskey and Zulu types strongly resembled enlarged and modified Type XXI boats in hull form and internal layout. For Britain and France, XU boats served as testbeds that guided the design of their own fast diesel-electric submarines of the 1950s and 1960s. Thus, even as individual German hulls rusted away, the concepts behind them became the basis of nearly every non-nuclear submarine built during the first decades of the Cold War. The surviving museum U-boats. Only a handful of World War II U-boats survive today, all as museum ships or major exhibits. Each has its own post-war story. U-505, captured in 1944 and used for intelligence work, she avoided target ship fate thanks to a preservation campaign. Since 1954 she has been on display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, restored to wartime condition and housed in a dedicated underground exhibit. U-995. After post-war service in the Norwegian Navy as Cora, she was returned to Germany and opened in 1971 as a museum boat at the Lebeau Naval Memorial near Kiel, commemorating sailors of both World Wars. U-2540. A late-war Type XXI boat that was scuttled by her crew on May 4, 1945, she was raised in 1957, rebuilt, and served in the new West German Bundesmarine as the trial submarine Wilhelm Bauer until 1982. In 1984 she became a museum ship at Bremerhaven, restored to her wartime appearance, and representing the only Type XXI still afloat. U-534, a Type IXC boat sunk by British aircraft in May 1945 near Denmark. She was raised in 1993 and eventually became a museum exhibit in Birkenhead, England. Her broken hull sections allow visitors to see the interior machinery more easily. Together these four boats preserve the physical reality of the U-boat war and serve as memorials to the tens of thousands of submariners, German and Allied, who died at sea. U-boat graveyards beneath the Atlantic. Beyond the museum ships, the true resting places of most U-boats are on the seabed. The wrecks of boats destroyed in combat lie scattered across the North Atlantic, Arctic and coastal waters of Europe, often alongside the ships they sank. The Operation Deadlight U-boats form a particularly dense graveyard northwest of Ireland and Scotland. Modern sonar surveys and occasional dives by research teams have identified many of these wrecks, often still recognizably resting in rows where tugs cast them adrift for gunnery practice. These sites are gradually attracting interest from maritime archaeologists and environmental scientists. The wrecks are war graves but also slowly corroding steel structures containing fuel residues, batteries, and other materials. So far, however, no serious effort has been made to raise or scrap them. They are considered relatively stable and historically important. Conclusion: from terror of the seas to ghosts of history. So what happened to the German U-boats after World War II? Hundreds were already gone by 1945, destroyed in combat or scuttled by their own crews under orders like Operation Regenbogen. Of those that survived the fighting, more than 150 surrendered to the Allies. The great majority of those surrendered boats, 116 in total, were deliberately sunk during Operation Deadlight in the winter of 1945-46, consigned to deep Atlantic waters as an act of disarmament and a way to prevent a new submarine arms race. A small group of around 30 U-boats were taken over by the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union as technological prizes, with a few more going to France, Norway, and other allies. These vessels were tested, sometimes placed in active service for a few years, and eventually scrapped or sunk. Just four boats, U-505, U-995, U-2540, and U-534, survive as museum ships, bearing silent witness to a campaign that cost the lives of roughly 75% of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm. In strategic terms, the U-boat fleet died with the Third Reich. In technological terms, however, it became the blueprint for the next generation of submarines worldwide, especially through the revolutionary Type XXI design. Today, rusting hulls on the Atlantic seabed, a few preserved iron coffins in museums, and the enduring lessons written into Cold War submarine design are all that remain of Hitler's once feared U-Bootwaffe. The underwater wolves that once stalked the world's shipping lanes have become ghosts, objects of study, memorials to the dead, and reminders of how quickly even the most terrifying weapons can themselves be swept into history.